This story is dramatized. Names and some events have been changed. It was 32 degrees when I stepped out of the taxi, and the snow hit me like a slap. White everywhere, cars blurred under flurries, the breath in my mouth a brief pale cloud. The porch light at the Whitlocks house cut a circle of gold into the blue night. Inside, through the frost-rimmed window, I could see them, faces lit by firelight, wine clinking, a chorus of laughter that swallowed the sound of the storm. That should have been the first thing, a room full of people who were warm, who were safe. Instead, it became the image that refused to leave me, the one that would roll in my head for months, the one that would be played over and over in my mind like a film stuck on a cruel loop. Then I heard it, not the laughter, but a small, ragged noise, half a whimper, half the scuffle of cloth. I should have known something was wrong the second I saw the shape on the porch through the window. A figure huddled by the door, shoulders curled inward as if trying to make herself small enough to disappear. Emily was wearing a thin blouse, the kind that might be pretty in July, not on Christmas Eve with the thermometer barely over freezing. Her hair was damp with snow where it had stuck to her neck. She looked like a stray bird that had mistaken a roof for shelter. I walked across the snow and did what any mother who had once been a coach would do. I took stock before I struck. I noticed the way her hands trembled, the red rim around her eyes, the way she pressed her arms into her body. Then I pressed the doorbell. The sound of the chime inside was swallowed by a laugh. The house answered slow, as if the laughter itself were a lock that refused to open. When somebody finally came to the door, Evelyn Whitlock, her cheeks rouged, her smile practiced. Their happiness hardened into something else the moment she saw me. "Rose," she said, and there was a pause, the way you pause before you decide if you are going to be charitable or cruel. "You must have taken a wrong turn." I didn't step back. My muscles remembered the mats, the posture of a stance you don't break. "Emily," I said. I didn't ask. The name held everything. The miscarriages that had hollowed her, the night she had curled in my kitchen in the dark, the appointment she dragged herself to, and the time she came home empty-handed. The name carried the smell of baby powder and antiseptic, and the pinch of hospital fluorescent light. It carried 1,000 whispered consolations that never quite healed a deeper ache. Evelyn's laugh thinned. Harold Whitlock, stooped, formal, his jaw set like a hinge, came into view behind her. He moved like someone who'd been taught not to be touched by other people's tangles. Abigail, their daughter-in-law, glanced up from her seat at the fire with a sort of mock sympathy that makes you want to spit. They were wearing celebration like armor. There were candles and a roast in the other room, and the room smelled of something old money and rehearsed, orange peel and pine, and a faint trace of citrus-scented cleaner. Emily tried to stand when she saw me, but she couldn't find her feet. Her lips were blue at the edges. "Ma," she said, and it was an apology she had no need to make. "You're not dressed for," Evelyn began, then stopped, because some things don't need finishing. Evelyn smiled too wide. "She likes the cold," Abigail said. A joke, a small avalanche of other people's amusement. I saw the way their eyes slid to Ryan, their son, sitting comfortably by the fire with a glass of something dark and old. Ryan's smile was practiced too, softer than his father's, but the same breed. He looked at Emily the way people look at objects that need sorting, interesting for a moment, then to be put aside. I didn't fumble for anything clever. People in my life had learned how I moved, fast, hands sure. I opened the door. The heat hit me, velvet light and the smell of roast and brandy. It felt like a lie. It felt like the room had swallowed a person whole. "Get inside," I told Emily. My voice was not loud. It was the controlled calm of someone who has to be clear. It broke anyway. "Get inside now." They protested. Evelyn's voice was a scalpel. "Rose, really, this is our home." "She's freezing," I said. "She is not to be treated like a—" Words narrowed and snapped. I could have said worse. I didn't. There was Emily, fragile, and I had been a coach my whole life. Teach the form, keep your center, react. My fists clenched the way they used to when someone tried to cheap shot one of my students in the gym. Same reflex, different fight. Ryan rose then, slow, with a look I'd seen 100 times on athletes who thought they owned the court. "What is this, a scene?" he asked. "Rose, it's Christmas." "You left her out there," I said. The accusation hung. Hot words, cold facts. "You left her on the porch in thin clothes while you sat laughing by the fire." I shifted. A few of the smiles faltered. I could see the small calculations. Privilege is a practice thing. We were trying to make her comfortable, he said. She likes a brisk evening. No one in the room sounded like they meant it. That lie was peeled off like a loose nail. You mock her pain, I said. You've mocked her every time she cried. 4 miscarriages, depression. You made jokes about bad luck as if it were a party trick. If that's your idea of family, then you don't get to pretend to be surprised when she looks like she might pass out on your steps. The room went quiet in the way a wound goes white. Harold's face, smooth as stone for most things, tightened. He said nothing. Money protects people in more ways than one. Behind their voices, in their manner, in the way a man's silence can fill a room. Then, in the doorway, a new noise. A soft leather tread across the snow. Jake stepped onto the porch, uniform folded into him like armor. He had been one of my students, quiet, disciplined, the kid who learned how to listen to his balance on the mat. The last time I'd seen him wear a uniform, it had been a little different. Now the badge caught the porch light and flashed. He didn't look surprised to see me. He did look surprised to see Emily in the snow. I was just making my rounds, he said, voice low. He paused, then added, figured I'd check on the Whitlocks after a neighbor's tree fell. Heard. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. He had been walking by at the right moment, as people do in small towns, and as fate sometimes lines up in messy, useful ways. I told him to call in, calmly, like a person ticking off a list. One call, a report. Nothing melodramatic. Paperwork is the scaffolding that gives you a fight you can actually win. He radioed from the porch, glancing at Emily. His look was more than official. It was private, like he'd seen someone he knew in trouble. You could read sympathy in how his shoulder slumped. He had once told me, years earlier, after he'd gotten a bruise sparring, "Coach, it's easier when someone knows what the hurt feels like." He had not forgotten. Inside, Evelyn's face was a portrait of cultivated offense. "You have no right," she said. "This is an invasion." My hand found Emily's elbow and steadied her. She didn't fight me. She let me guide her into the house, feeling perhaps for the first time in a long while like she had an ally who refused to be polite about cruelty. The house closed behind us with the soft finality of a slammed book. I won't lie, I considered many things in those minutes. I thought about breaking plates. I thought about taking Emily and walking back to the taxi and never coming back. But Emily looked at me not like a woman making threats, but like a girl who had spent too much of her life trying to disappear. There was a ledger in her eyes of all the time she'd been told to move on or be grateful. You can't tell someone to move on from a loss that takes up the inside of them. We drove to my apartment, which is modest and has no pretense, just a couch that remembers mercy and a kettle that boils fast. I nested Emily there with blankets and a thermos of hot broth, something simple that slips past appetite but restores warmth. We sat on the couch and I fed her with a spoon like I'd fed a sprained child, because that's what mothers do when the world is too cold. "You could have called me," she said then, small and ashamed and not understanding that she had been calling me for years in ways that didn't show up as phone calls. I tried to. I thought I could handle it. "You handled nothing," I said softly. "You handled a hell of endurance. You did not fail anyone. Not me, not yourself." It was hard to keep my voice steady. The storm outside sounded like a chorus of small threats. Inside, the kettle hissed. The next morning, I found Dr. Linda Carter, who has a quiet way of making grief into work. She sat opposite us in a room that smelled faintly of lemon and old books. She asked Emily to tell her, and Emily spoke in fragments. Certain holidays where she had been minimized, jokes at her expense when a child was mentioned at the table, a cousin's offhand remark about risk and burden. She told Dr. Carter about nights when Ryan would stand at the bedroom doorway and say things like, "Maybe you're better off not trying," as if removing desire was the kindest cruelty. Dr. Carter didn't gasp. She wrote, she listened, she validated. She used words that didn't carry judgment. "This is real," she said. "This hurts. Depression is not a character flaw. We will work on this." Validation matters. It becomes armor. I saw in Emily's face the beginning of something that resembled permission, to exist, to grieve without being blamed. That day, Dr. Linda recommended a safety plan. She explained gently what trauma looks like, and she helped me understand how to fold these moments into structures, appointments, medication conversations, a therapist's calendar, so Emily could begin to find her center again. While we did that, I set a different kind of motion in place, the paperwork. I am not a lawyer. I am a woman who once taught people how to hold a stance and control their breath. But I know that if you want to change how the world treats you, you must feed it something concrete. I started collecting anything that would show the pattern. Messages where Ryan joked about tough luck, emails where the Whitlocks refused to give Emily credit for maternity leave, bank statements that showed transfers with notes like payment for cleanup instead of support. I saved receipts from doctor's appointments, the list of missed prenatal ultrasounds, the dates, the wait times, the coldness of hospital chairs. I wrote down every conversation Emily could remember, every cutting phrase. I printed everything. I made folders with labels and dates, like a coach marking an athlete's progress. Evidence, I told myself, is muscle memory for legal fights. The Whitlocks noticed. Not long after, an envelope slid under my door with no return address. A single sheet of paper, polite and thin, like a tea-stained warning. The language was careful. We ask you to refrain from involving yourself in family matters. These are private issues. It read more like a note from someone practicing gentility than an attempt at intimidation. But intimidation doesn't need to be a howl. It can be a well-suited whisper. I folded the note and put it in the folder that held the medical receipts. I put the phone numbers in a small cardboard box and labeled it if needed. Jake called daily then, as if the patrol route had been redrawn to include our building. He came with paperwork, compassion, and the kind of silence that isn't empty, but is full of presence.
He sat with Emily sometimes and ate the terrible takeout I considered too burned to eat, and he counted the spoons in our sink like a man who finds small rituals reassuring. He did not flirt. He did not offer cheap consolation. He watched Emily like someone guarding a fragile bird. You could see a tenderness in his jaw when Emily laughed at something small. He would straighten like a person startled by his own heart. He was not a rescuer in the saloon hero sense. He was simple and steady, and sometimes that is closest to hands that protect. We met a lawyer, Mr. James, a man whose suit felt like an appointment. He was practical and not melodramatic, which in this sort of fight is sometimes worse than a firebrand. He sorted through the folders, his fingers moving like a mechanic checking an engine. "We can file a motion," he said. "We can seek temporary orders, move for custody, anything we need to protect Emily while this is ongoing. But you need to understand, Harold Whitlock is not a small fish. He has influence. The other side will fight to bury this." I told him about the recording. On that Christmas Eve, when I stormed in and the words were exchanged, I had slipped my phone into my pocket and held it on the porch, a small device pressed against my hip like a talisman. I didn't plan to be a spy. I planned to be a witness for my child. The recording captured Evelyn's thin cruelty, Abigail's mock sympathy, the scorn in Ryan's voice when he brushed off Emily's tears as theater. It was a raw thing, muffled at times, honest at others. "That's the smoking gun," I said. Mr. James didn't smile. He rubbed his forehead. "It's powerful," he said, "but the other side will move to exclude it. Chain of custody, consent, whether the recording was obtained lawfully, all sorts of objections." He named the procedural thickets with the weary detachment of someone who had seen justice chewed at by rules. "We will try," he said, "but be prepared." I knew then that the fight would be as much about rules as it would be about truth. That is something a coach learns early. The match is only half combat. The other half is navigating the referee. Sometimes the referee is fair. Sometimes the referee is an extension of the opponent. I closed my eyes and felt the cat-like tension in my muscles, the way you'd prepare for a sparring partner who never intended to play fair. We began a quiet campaign. I called the housekeeper, Mrs. Martha, discreetly. She had worked at the Whitlocks for decades and remembered details that people with privileges forget. She remembered the nights Emily waited at the foot of the stairs to hear a shred of sympathy. She remembered Ryan's offhand comments about not wanting more children, and the look on Harold's face when someone mentioned inheritance. Mrs. Martha's voice was low with the fatigue of someone who'd witnessed too many small cruelties in polished rooms. She agreed to write a statement. She was careful.
She wanted no trouble, but she also wanted to be truthful. We gathered more. Emails, texts, notes Emily had kept in the margins of her calendar. There were medical records that didn't prove intent, but showed the rhythm of grief, appointments, and emptiness. There were witnesses who would be delicate to call, a cousin who'd seen Emily's tears dismissed as hysteria, a friend who had been told to get a grip. We printed out everything. I made a new folder and wrote in big letters, "Protected." Then the threats widened like a smear. Someone left a flyer in the mailbox, a thin sheet with what looked like an editorial, suggesting that Emily had been unstable and that outsiders were sensationalizing private marital difficulties. A few messages to my phone were clipped and polite. One came from a blocked number and said, "Back off or things get hard." I took a photograph and handed it to Jake. He froze the moment on his phone and said he'd run a trace. He didn't promise much more than that he would note it. He had the posture of someone who knows how to keep files in place until they are needed. There were nights I woke in the dark and counted the cost of everything. We had the factual record, yes, dates and receipts and the recording. But the court is not always a mirror. It's a lens that bends under pressure. Harold Whitlock had been a judge once, That fact sits like a weight in your chest when you consider the system that is supposed to protect you. Influence is a quiet, steady thing. It doesn't have to yell. It buys the right to move in certain lanes. That reality is ugly and practical. It does not care about the justice you think you deserve. That is a lesson I had hoped my daughter would never learn. Despite it, we moved forward. Mr. James filed temporary motions to secure a restraining order if needed, to secure temporary housing arrangements, to ensure Emily had access to her bank accounts and her medical records. The Whitlocks responded with motions of their own, requests for privacy, mentions of family issues not suitable for public airing. Legal filings came like waves. Sometimes the language made me nauseous. Sometimes it made me laugh in a way that tasted like bile. In one document, there was a line about unfounded allegations, and their lawyer's handwriting was neat and thin, as if cruelty needed only to be presented politely to be believed. We rehearsed. Mr. James had Emily recount events in a room with a coffee machine and an impartial clock. Tell the story as it happened, he said. Short sentences. Avoid conjecture. Answer only what is asked. He was a man of process, but Emily, with her small guarded smile, had something else, an ember that had not yet been smothered. She practiced saying, "I was left on the porch," and he minimized my losses. She did not cry in his office until she failed, finally, to hold it in. Then we took a breath and let the tears come. Let the map of pain be drawn in lines everyone could read. A couple of days later, I walked Emily to Dr. Linda's office for another appointment. Outside, the sky had hardened into a block of gray. The city had its own rhythm of gossip already starting. A headline here, a sidebar there, a friend of a friend who said they trusted the Whitlocks. Social opinion is a shifting thing. People want the tidy version of a story that fits their Sunday brunch. The rest of us live in the ragged edges, where the truth isn't neat, and where the person who is heard keeps getting asked to tidy themselves up for the world. In the waiting room, Emily clutched a small keychain Jake had given her, a simple metal charm engraved with a tiny leaf. He said it was a reminder that new growth takes time, she told me later, clutching the chain like a talisman. Small gestures accumulate. They remind you that the world contains both cruelty and kindness. That is how you keep moving. There were other small acts of resistance. A neighbor named Tom left a tray of casseroles at our door with a note, "If there is anything you need, we are here." A barista at the coffee shop wrote "Stay strong" on the lid of a latte. These things do not change verdicts, but they change evenings. They build a latticework of normalcy in which a person can step without being crushed by their own memory. The recording sat in a folder on my desk. At night, I would play the snippet quietly to remember the sound of their voices, the way Evelyn's laugh cut through Emily's whimper. It made me both braver and more resigned. Mr. James advised against public playback. If it comes to court, he said, we must be strategic. That word, strategic, felt like a shield and a trap. You could do everything by the book and still lose. On a cold morning, a courier arrived with a thick envelope of documents, one from the Whitlocks attorneys, a threat of suit if we pursued public defamation. The letter was aggressive but circumspect. It had the whiff of a man who had been taught to use words like weapons in a well-mannered duel. Mr. James smiled without humor and told me to keep it. Let them threaten, he said. Threats are often their loudest show of weakness. I wanted to be louder. I wanted to go to the Whitlock house and drag a banner across the lawn. But I had been a coach long enough to know the value of the long game. Victory isn't always a shout. Sometimes it's a slow, methodical accumulation of small wins. A witness who won't be intimidated. A doctor's note. A neighbor's statement. Sometimes it's the slow, steady culling of small cruelties. I taught my students to chip over at the problem until the problem was nothing but loose debris. There were hard nights. Emily would sometimes go to sleep and wake with a start, the past pressing like a damp cloth to her face. She would say she felt ashamed for being hurt, as if pain were a moral failing. You didn't do this to yourself, I would tell her. The way you tell a bruised child. You survived it. There's a difference.
Dr. Linda reinforced that there is no shame in needing help. Depression is a cloud that the mind lives under, not a failing. Jake started to tell stories of the town in little moments. He would say, "My dad says you never forget someone who kept your hand when you were falling." He had a dry humor about him that surfaced sometimes. If he had a do-over coach, "Would you ever stop teaching me that spinning hook kick?" He would grin in a way that made Emily blush. Those moments of ordinary conversation became the things that stitched days back together. Not everyone rushed to our defense. Some people wanted to keep the Whitlocks as they had always been, pillars, untouchable. Privilege buys inertia. I received comments online that suggested Emily was making the whole thing up for attention. I deleted them mostly, because the internet is a place that likes to cast stones at anyone who is bleeding. But other messages came from strangers who sent brief, brave notes. "You're not alone. My sister went through this. Thank you for speaking up."
Those messages were unexpected lifelines. They reminded me that the town was not monolithic. It contained a quiet majority who would watch and then, in their own ways, act. Still, the Whitlocks moved in their own orbit. Harold, formerly a judge, did not have to raise his voice to be heard. People respected the creases around his mouth. He sent a representative to court with a file so thick it made Mr. James glance up. The other side was ready to make the case that Emily's distress was a domestic matter, personal and private, and not something to be litigated in public to tarnish their name. The language of reputation. I hate that word. We scheduled depositions. We printed more pages. I tossed a lifetime of coaching discipline into organizing testimony. Time, place, quote, witness. We rehearsed Emily's memory like a set of sequences. What she said, what he said back, where someone had sat, what had been in her hand. Memory is a fickle thing, but the pattern kept repeating. Trivialization, mockery, isolation. Patterns survive poor recollection. The night before the first pretrial hearing, I sat on my couch and went over everything again. The folder burst with paper. I played the recording once more and listened for the parts that would land like small hammers in a courtroom. I thought about the courtroom itself, an old room with wood too polite to show anger, a judge's bench that commands quiet. I knew the Whitlocks would deploy every bolt of propriety they could muster. I expected objections to be launched like grenades of procedure, and I prepared for that. Preparation is the only real defiance left against a system that often values process over truth. When the day came, Jake stood outside the courthouse, coat collar turned up, as if the cold could be a kind of armor too. He looked like someone who had seen enough to know the stakes of patience.
There was a small crowd. Neighbors, a reporter or two who had smelled a story, and a few people who came because they had hearts that felt too big for the quiet. I held Emily's hand. She had put on a sweater that was the color of damp stone. She looked like someone who had decided she would not be invisible that day. Inside, our lawyer filed our motions. The Whitlocks lawyers moved with a fluid precision that came from years of practice. At one point, in the hallway between court sessions, a man in an expensive coat said something under his breath about a mess. He made it sound quaint. He did not have to sit with the ache Emily carried. Men like him throw neat nouns at sorrow and call it solved. Judges' clerks shuffled papers. There was a moment when a woman in a suit, one of the Whitlocks' legal team, leaned close to our lawyer and said, "You have a recording? That could complicate things for you." She smiled, but it was a smile that carried the suggestion of a chess player claiming a strategic advantage, while still polite enough to be assumed honorable. I could taste my anger like metal. That evening, as snow started again and smudged the town into soft gray, someone posted a photograph that would later change the tenor of how people spoke about us. It was taken from across the street, Emily on the porch, wrapped in a thin blouse, while inside a warm room a group of people laughed. The image, stark and simple, translated the cruelty into something the world could see without listening to explanations. It was a single frame that did what long explanations could not. It made people feel the contrast. I went to bed tired enough to sink through the mattress. There was a dangerous sort of hope that comes with action, a belief that if you take enough right steps, the world will correct. But experience teaches you to hold hope like a fragile thing, cupped in both hands. The fight was only beginning, and the lines were drawn. We had witnesses, a recording, receipts, and an army of small acts. The other side had influence and practiced denial. The legal dance had its own rhythm and its own traps. We had placed our pieces, and now, like any player, I learned to sit and wait for the opponent's move. Outside, the wind pressed against the window in a pattern that sounded almost like whispering. I half expected it to say, "This will end well," or "This will break you," depending on which voice the night chose to borrow. I did not know which it would be. I only knew I would not let them make my daughter disappear on the steps of a house while the rest of the world laughed my afire. The morning of our scheduled deposition, a plain white envelope arrived at my apartment with no return address. Inside was a single page with copy-colorgraphed handwriting and a sentence that read, "You should be careful how much you expose." It was the sort of message meant to slide under your skin and settle like a splinter. I folded it, placed it in the folder labeled "Protected," and then, because routine steadies you, I called Jake and asked him to stop by. He came and knocked once with the familiarity of someone dropping in to see how you were weathering the storm. He did not laugh or offer a grand gesture. He sat and made us tea, and his quietness was what steadied Emily. We prepared for deposition like a team preparing for competition. Mr. James outlined the ground rules, what they might ask, where they could try to trip us, how to hold posture under pressure. "They'll try to make Emily sound unreliable," he said,
They'll say she's emotional. They will attempt to cast her grief as irrational. Stay to facts. He had the bleak look of a man who had learned how truth can be frayed by the counters of the courtroom. Emily practiced voice and pause and timing. There were moments when she would break, and we would put an arm around her and let her breathe. Those breaths were like stitches. They held things together just long enough for us to proceed. I remember the way the reporter outside the courthouse tried to put words in my mouth, aiming for the sensational. I refused. I am practitioner of restraint not because I am meek, but because I was taught to strike at the correct moment. The wrong word on a microphone can be a misstep that the other side exploits. That night, as snow came down and settled like a hush, someone posted the picture from the porch to a small community forum. It began to spread quietly among people who had been on email lists and neighborhood groups. There were comments, some cruel, some curious, some supportive. The picture did not win the case for us. It did not declare a winner, but it punctured the armor of genteel denial that had covered the Whitlocks for years. People began to speak in a different tone, and that softened something in the air. Yet, even as the town whispered, the threats continued in subtler forms. Someone delivered a box of old family photographs to the door with a note that suggested we had no right to air dirty laundry. I opened the box and found images of Ryan as a boy, smiling with a kite. They were meant to humanize, to complicate the public's perception. I put the photographs in the appropriate folder and labeled them for context. Remember humanity. Do not let it distract you. We sleepwalking into the next steps. Depositions were scheduled. The Whitlocks lined up their people like a phalanx. A marriage counselor, a distant cousin, a financial advisor who knew the family holdings. Mrs. Martha's statement was brief but devastating in its quietness. She wrote that she had seen Emily curled in the kitchen at night and had heard laughter upstairs. There was no fanfare in her words, only observation, which, when multiplied by the records we had, started to feel like a net. The legal rhythm has a way of making ordinary life feel like prep for performance. There were dinners eaten while rehearsing testimony, mornings where the only calm we had was when we sat in a circle and made lists. I practiced speaking in short sentences with Emily. I trained my hands not to shake when the phone rang. I made sure the kettle boiled and the house felt like a harbor. Coaching isn't just about physical drills. It's about arranging the world to give your team the best chance to stand. And yet, there was an ugly awareness that no matter how many folders we made, no matter how many witness statements we collected, there was a part of the fight that had nothing to do with facts. Influence is a country in and of itself. It has its own laws. We would be up against a man who once wore the robe of a judge. The vestiges of power can be an echo that resounds in places procedure rarely uncovers. The person who wields that power does not have to shout. He can let the machinery of politesse do its work. A week before depositions, a private investigator, an unremarkable man with tired eyes, left a note saying he'd been following the Whitlocks movements and had evidence of a pattern. He wanted to be paid. Mr. James weighed the expense and the ethics and then hired him for a short period. The investigator compiled a few things: a record of the Whitlocks' charitable donations timed to moments when publicity would repair reputation, receipts that showed payments to consultants the week a narrative needed reframing. It felt petty to write about such things, but in a courtroom, petty can combine into a pattern. The town began to divide, quietly. Some people insisted on privacy. Some people asked for proof. Others offered us casseroles. At the grocery store, a woman I taught years earlier, she had been in my adult taekwondo class, came up to me and said, "I always knew you'd be a bulldog for your girls." It was a small compliment, and it reminded me who I had been for so many small people. On the morning of depositions, I woke early with the sort of adrenaline that makes your hands tingle. I went over Emily's statements in my head, not to coach her on truth, but to keep her voice steady. There are moments when the world asks you to be brave and gives you very little instruction on how. I chose to be practical. I made coffee, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and rehearsed lines in the mirror like an athlete warming muscles. We left the apartment. The air hit my face like a critic. The snow had smoothed the town into homeliness, as if nothing dreadful could ever happen under such a soft blanket. I wanted to feel that way too. I wanted the town to be small enough that kindness could be the rule and cruelty an exception. But I had been in enough fights to know that not all wounds are accidental. At the law offices that morning, standing under fluorescent lights with my folders, I felt the small, ridiculous pride that comes when you show up for something that matters. My hands were steady. I had arranged facts. I had people willing to speak. I had a recording tucked away, a small device that captured the sound of cruelty in the warmth of a holiday home. We moved forward one page at a time. We stepped into the machinery. In the hallway outside the hearing room, as our lawyer final-checked documents, Emily squeezed my hand. She said nothing, but her eyes held a promise, not to be invisible, not to accept the world as it had been for so long. Her chin lifted, as though she had remembered a posture from 1,000 classes, a stance that held her upright. We walked into the deposition room together. Light struck the table. Cameras were not allowed, only people and paper and the kind of recorded testimony that would sit in a file, waiting. The other side's counsel sat with the practiced ease of someone who has argued in certain rooms many times. There was an exchange of names, the click of recorders, a formal tone that tried to flatten life into the kind of statements that fit neat pages. Emily began to speak. Her voice trembled at first, and then she found her rhythm. It was not perfect. It was not meant to be. It was honest. She talked about the porch and the thin blouse and the way laughter seemed to become a weapon. She spoke in measured phrases of the 4 miscarriages that had hollowed out years and left a map of small, private griefs. She spoke of the depression that followed, and of how Ryan had blessed some days with affection and others with a kind of cold that felt like punishment. She did not sensationalize. She told the truth she knew. Outside, when the depositions ended, there was a small crowd again. The photograph of the porch had now circulated beyond the town. People were saying things in coffee shops, over fences. The Whitlocks lawyers insisted that the photograph was selective, that it didn't tell the whole story. But the image had done something that evidence on a page could not always do. It had made an emotional truth visible. At the end of the day, we walked back to the car together, tired and raw. Emily carried the little leaf keychain in her palm like a promise. Jake stood a little ways off, his breath a small cloud, his eyes steady. He didn't ask for anything. He only made sure we were safely in the car before he turned away. There is a particular way that fear sits in your chest when the world begins to respond. It's not the end of the fight. It's an escalation. The Whitlocks would not give up. They had too much to lose. But neither would we. That night, as snow fell soft and steady, I lay awake and thought about the porch image, the bright interior, the shivering figure on the step. I thought about how small gestures like a photograph can change the sound of a town.
I thought about how procedure and pain would soon meet in a room with a judge's bench and a clock. We had momentum, but momentum isn't victory. It is only motion. I knew we had to be precise now, even as our hearts wanted to roar. We had to keep our center, like a fighter waiting for the bell, balanced, breathing, refusing to throw wild punches that would leave us open. The days blurred into motions, filings, phone calls, coffees, the soft thud of a stapler sealing another packet of facts. There were moments that felt like training drills, practice answers, timed pauses, the ritual of lining up facts like cones on a mat. There were also the moments that no one can rehearse for, the newsroom's curiosity, the neighbor who pretended not to notice, the way Emily would sometimes flinch at a laugh that sounded too much like the one that had echoed in the Whitlock dining room. If this story touches something in you, please like and subscribe. It's how we keep telling lives that often get quieted. One small ask, nothing more. The trial was scheduled like a storm. We arrived early that first day, the courthouse columns pale against a sky that threatened snow. People in suits moved with the calm of habit. People like us moved with the urgency of those not used to being ignored. The Whitlocks were there in numbers that smelled of preparation, tidy hair, polite faces, a flurry of small courtesies that functioned like armor. Harold sat close to the front, his fingers folded, his expression a practiced blank. Ryan looked even softer than in the photograph. There is a particular danger in men who look harmless. People assume a softness means goodness. His lawyers were like chess players, pleasant and ruthless all at once. The first day was largely procedural, the judge setting timelines, the lawyers confirming witnesses. We were allowed to call Mrs. Martha and 3 neighbors for depositions, and the judge agreed, briefly and without much inflection, that the case would proceed. There was a strictness to his voice that tried to hold the room even-handed. Underneath it, though, you could feel the tension of 2 systems colliding, the legal machine and the messy human truth. One of the pivotal hearings was on evidence, whether I could play the recording I had taken on the porch that night. We treated that little audio like a talisman. It carried in its muddy tones the sound of mockery and the edge of disdain that had stripped Emily Finn. In my kitchen, it had made me both savage and serene. In a courtroom, the same sound could be a noise to be chopped by rules.
Mr. James prepared us for procedural fights, chain of custody, expectation of privacy, the rules about one-party recordings. He said it with the weary patience of a man explaining techniques to a rookie. They'll try to disqualify it, he warned. The floor will be technical, and they are excellent at playing there. The Whitlocks counsel moved first.
She was slim and impeccable, a woman who smiled while she dismantled. In front of the judge, she argued that the recording had been obtained unlawfully, that its admission would prejudice the jury, that it had been manipulated. Small legal knives. I watched Emily from the gallery. She sat with her hands in her lap, and there was a distance in her eyes, as if part of her were watching herself be discussed like a case study. Mr. James objected with the quiet force of someone who does his violent work with paper. He argued that the recording captured relevant statements, that it was contemporaneous, and that excluding it would silence a witness. The judge listened, his face a careful geography of neutrality. Then he spoke in a tone that felt like cold water. He ruled the recording inadmissible. The explanation was technical, rules about consent and whether a private conversation can be used, but the effect landed like a blow. The one piece of evidence that had felt unstoppable was now cut loose from the narrative of the court. I am mindful of the probative value versus the prejudicial effect, the judge said, and in that sentence, all our hope of a clean, audible truth to be played aloud in court dwindled. When the gavel came down, the room exhaled into a new kind of quiet. I felt my body go rigid, a posture I knew well from competitions, when an opponent pulls a trick and the referee honors it. The Whitlock table smiled politely, the sort of smile that is taught in rooms where consequence is managed with careful hands. Emily lowered her gaze and squeezed my hand. I could have shouted. I could have charged the bench. Instead, I sat and breathed, and the muscle memory of a coach steadied me. There would be other witnesses. There would be paper. The law is complicated. Compassion is not always admitted in neat sound bites. The hearings that followed were a slow siege. Mrs. Martha spoke with gentle honesty. Her testimony was not dramatic. It was steady and precise. The details of a million small nights. She recalled Emily sitting by the stove at odd hours, the sound of muffled crying, the laughter that filtered up from the dining room like something abrasive. It was the accumulation of those small observations that built a pattern. A neighbor, Tom, testified about the time he saw Emily outside in light clothing. Another friend recounted being told by Ryan in a conversation, years before, that having more children might be problematic because of the family finances. Small stones, when placed together, could form a wall. The Whitlocks produced their witnesses with equal care. There was a marriage counselor, a man with a gentle cadence, who testified that he'd seen a loving relationship, and that from his perspective, Emily appeared vulnerable but not abused. A financial advisor spoke of transactions and tax benefits, framing the family's decisions in the language of fiduciary care. Their approach was simple: reframe the private pain as a domestic issue, not a legal one. Cross-examinations were the uglier part of the fight. We learned the shape of tactic and counter-tactic, suggestive questions, the attempt to turn sorrow into drama, grief into unreliability. The other side's counsel had a way of saying things politely that cut like glass. "Isn't it true you sometimes overreact?" one lawyer asked Emily, as if shame could be surgical. "Would you agree that emotions can color memory?" asked another, implying that sorrow twisted facts. Emily answered as best she could. There were moments when she faltered, and I felt something like a physical pain in my chest. But then she would steady, take a breath, and speak again. Her voice was not a study in performance. It was testimony in the rawest sense, witness to what happened to her. There was a blow we had not anticipated. When the Whitlock lawyers produced financial documents and property valuations in a way that made the risk of losing everything feel like a background hum. They argued that the assets had been gathered or invested in good faith, that divorce did not necessarily equate to a finding of abuse. Their rhetoric was calm as a bank ledger. It folded warmth into calculus. You realize at moments like that how money can be a language that persuades before the human story even gets a look in. The most painful moment came in the judge's final days of deliberation. The courtroom was full with people who had come to witness the unfolding. I watched faces in the gallery, some sympathetic, some braced. Emily sat beside me, stoic, in a way that made me want to cry for her and with pride. When the judge finally spoke, his voice sounded like a slow axle turning. He granted the divorce. The words fell into the room and felt like a small mercy, a legal end to a marriage that had worn her thin. But he also stated that upon review of the admissible evidence, the court could not legally recognize a pattern of domestic abuse as defined under the statutes he was bound to interpret. He acknowledged the pain Emily had testified to, but explained that emotional cruelty, as devastating as it might be, did not meet the threshold required by the law to be labeled abuse in a way that would affect certain financial determinations. More than that, the judge ruled in favor of distributing the bulk of shared assets to the husband, citing prior investments, business entanglements, and legal precedents. His summary was clinical, delivered with an impartial cadence that offered no consolation. The air in the courtroom seemed to rearrange itself into two worlds after that sentence: the world of legal formalities and the world of everyday truth. We had won a divorce, yes, but the verdict was a bitter lesson in what the law can and cannot do. The Whitlocks table did not leap in triumph. They had, after all, regained material advantage.
But to see Ryan exit with a sort of relief that looks like relief from being held to account made something in me like the taste of coal. Outside the courthouse, the crowd split open. Cameras waited like flies. Reporters wanted sound bites, and for a moment the world felt like one long microphone. Emily held her head high, but when she stepped into the light, she let out a small, human sob. I wrapped my coat around her and told her to breathe. Jake stood nearby with a face that was hard in a way that nearly scared me. He had every right to look furious, but he kept it in check until we were in the car. The online reaction was immediate and jagged. Threads appeared that praised Emily for having the courage to speak. Others suggested she had exaggerated. A few defended the Whitlocks' privacy. But the photograph, our original porch image, had been adapted into 1,000 thumbnails. People wrote, "How can they laugh?" And some wrote, "What else are we not seeing?" There were petitions, op-eds, and a small local TV segment in which a teacher I had coached called in to speak about what support looks like. The town began to murmur in new ways. The public outcry did not change the judge's ruling, nor did it recoup the assets. It did, however, create a pressure that could not be measured on a ledger. The Whitlocks' social standing faltered. Invitations dried up. A board that once sought Harold's presence deferred that invitation. Donors shifted to causes unconnected to the family name. Social reputation is brittle in a different way than legal holdings. It cracks under the weight of public sentiment and slow social distancing. For Emily, those shifts were not substitutions for legal vindication, but they were small pieces of a larger restorative arc. We set about rebuilding what the law had not repaired. The town's response was a mosaic of kindness. A local bookstore offered Emily a part-time position shelving and recommending books. The owner said quietly that everyone needed a job that treated them like someone useful again. A neighbor organized a meal roster that felt like a net, a dozen casseroles arriving in aluminum trays, a constant reminder that basic warmth could be constant. Friends donated clothing and money to make sure Emily had a cushion while we reorganized finances. Jake organized some small things with quiet humor. He'd show up with a spare pair of gloves for Emily, a thermos for our walks, and a playlist that he'd joke was doctor-recommended comfort music. These gestures were not dramatic. They were steady and they mattered. Therapy became the scaffold on which Emily rebuilt her days. Dr. Linda worked with her on grounding techniques, practical, non-ornate tools to stall panic when it rose. They spoke of grief in the language of tasks, naming the feelings, creating a safe list, identifying people and places that calm.
Linda insisted that the old objective of getting over it was not reasonable. Instead, she suggested an aim to integrate the loss. Let it become a part of Emily's map rather than the map itself. Some days, Emily could laugh at something small. Other days, the past would press on her chest like the weight of a winter coat. Progress was not linear. It was a series of tiny truths stacked like mats after a long drill. There was a moment that remains sharp in my memory, the first time Emily went to a holiday party after the trial. She wore a sweater that was neutral and an expression that was tentative. She arrived late, nervous, and spent a generous hour by the corner table, offering quiet conversation to a friend. At the end of the evening, she stepped out into the cold and stood with Jake, who had offered to walk her home. For no reason that required explanation, he took her hand and held it in both of his. He didn't kiss her that night. He didn't need to. The small, ordinary act of hand-holding after a long and public ruin was radical. That quiet human contact signaled that someone had decided to stand in the space where the law had not offered refuge. Jake's presence was not a romantic lightning strike. It was a slow thaw. He had been steady before the trial, consistent afterward, and then present in ways that required no pronouncement. Fixing a leaky sink, showing up for a late-night breakup of paperwork, listening when Emily needed to talk. He became one of the stitches in a day that was being sewn back together. Emily and he moved cautiously, with a mutual respect that felt like the right pace. There were nights when they would sit on my couch across from each other, both wrapped in sweaters, and talk about small things: a book she liked, a meal she'd once cooked poorly, a place in town they wanted to visit. They hinted at a future without grand promises, just mutual care and slow company. We watched, as mothers do, with a mixture of tenderness and guarded hope. The public conversation evolved too. Some who had initially defended the Whitlocks shifted, others doubled down on private matters. A local online fundraiser raised money for Emily to secure a rental deposit and some therapy hours. Neighbors contributed in small amounts. An anonymous donor sent in a sum that meant we could breathe more easily for a season. For a while, people left handwritten notes in our mailbox, short, sometimes clumsy, but real. "Thank you for showing courage," one said. "This town owes you better," wrote another. These words did not reverse the judge's determination, but they folded into Emily's days and made them lighter. We started to reclaim small rituals that had been stolen from us. The Saturday market, where Emily bought a bouquet of daffodils. The way we cooked soup and ate it from bowls with no pretension. The ritual of walking around the lake in quiet winter light. Each small repetition was a way of teaching the world to be ordinary again. It was in these routines that dignity crept back. Legal decisions shape certain realities, but the solid ground of daily life is where the rest of a person is rebuilt. There were complicating moments. The Whitlocks did not simply vanish. They addressed a social circle that still held sway. There were letters from law firms cautioning us about public defamation if we spoke too loudly. They attempted to donate to charities with press releases attached. Harold's reputation as a former judge meant people listened when he spoke. We learned the anatomy of power. It moves in whisper and check, in polite notes and financial leverage. And yet, even with their resources, the Whitlocks could not purchase back the moral intimacy they'd lost. That was not to say they suffered. Society is merciful in certain ways, but there were edges to their life that were no longer smooth. In quieter months after the verdict, Emily and I would sometimes sit on my couch and look at the little evidence folder I kept for myself, not as a tool for court, but as a chronicle of survival. There were pieces of paper, photos, a printout of a particularly cruel email sent by someone pretending to counsel kindness. None of it was glamorous. It was a ledger of endurance. I told Emily one evening while rain tapped like a million small fingers on the window that victory is not always loud. We won some things, I said, and we lost some things in court, but what we have now is real. We have each other, and we have proof that the town has room for care. She leaned her head on my shoulder then and said, "I feel small still sometimes." Her words were honest. She did not expect absolution. I told her what I had come to know in the months of fighting. There are different kinds of justice. Courtroom justice is one instrument. Community justice is another. Family justice is another. You can't always make the scales line up where the law would like to, but you can tilt a different kind of balance by restoring someone's sense of worth. That is slow. It is domestic. It is sometimes more meaningful than a pound of rhetoric in a courtroom. Time, as it does, eroded the edges of immediate pain. Spring arrived with a force that seemed almost rude, daffodils pushing through earth, a light that made it impossible to feel permanently cloaked in winter. Emily began spending more time outdoors, sometimes with Jake, sometimes with a group of friends who had rallied quietly. She began, perhaps for herself more than anyone else, to volunteer at a community center where women who had faced hardships came for coffee and skill workshops. She taught a small class on organization and resilience, lessons I taught her in the long months, about how to hold a stance, how to make a list, how to rest between hard things. I found myself proud in a way that felt older and deeper than youthful pride at a competitive win. There was a moment, months after the verdict, when Emily sent me a text. "I went to the lake today and didn't think about the porch." It was small and holy in its ordinariness. We met that evening and walked, and she pointed out the places where ducklings were appearing and where trees bent low over the water. I could see the color returning to her face like a slow tide. Jake walked beside her and occasionally brushed his fingers against hers. It wasn't a dramatic sweep into forever. It was the steady knitting of two people who had learned how to hold scars without making them the whole story. At a small dinner party at our place, just some friends, a casserole and a pie, Emily announced that she had applied for a new job that would let her work from home sometimes. She spoke the way someone releases a held breath. Her voice was not triumphant. It was practical, threaded with a small, defiantly ordinary hope. When Jake raised his glass to toast, he looked at her as if he wanted to say the whole novel of staying, and then he only said, "To good choices." Everyone clinked glasses, and the sound made the room briefly holy. I think about the ways institutions fail,
and the ways people repair. The court had given us a legal ending, but not the recognition many of us wanted. The judge's ruling was a factual mapping of law against circumstance, divorce granted, abuse not recognized in the legal sense, assets awarded to the husband. Those were the facts, and we honored them because we must honor the truth, even the truths that hurt. But the law's version of justice is not the only version. The community's response, the casseroles, the offers of work, the local TV piece that portrayed Emily as a person rather than a case, became a different kind of verdict. It said, in its messy, unformed way, that she mattered. On a bright afternoon when the air had the clean smell of new grass, Jake knocked on our door with 2 mugs of coffee and a small packet of seeds. "For your patch," he said to Emily, smiling. She took the seeds like someone receiving a future. I watched them plant them in a small pot on the balcony, the 2 of them kneeling, dirt under their fingernails, and thought of how fragile hope can be and how it needs care. There are mornings when I wake and the image of Emily on that porch is like a photograph still drying at the edge of a sink. I look at it and sometimes feel the old muscle memory of fury rise. I do not deny it. Rage is a legitimate instrument when injustice is served with recipe and garnish. But I also know, with the honest clarity that comes from many fights, that we have rebuilt something sturdier than perhaps anyone expected. A life that does not depend on a court's moral arithmetic to exist. We made a home where dignity could be practiced daily, in hot broth, in therapy sessions kept, in paying rent on time, in planting seedlings and showing up for small jobs. In the end, the story is not a tidy one.
The law did what it could within its language. The community did what the law could not. Emily carries the scars of private pain and public scrutiny, but she also carries little proofs that people will stand with you. A keychain, a casserole, a job, a neighbor's note. Jake stands in that proof as well. Quiet, unflashy, persistent. I am proud of the way she has learned to hold her feet firm again, to make a space in a world that once attempted to make her small. Sometimes at night, when the house is quiet and the kettle hums, I think of that porch, the cold air, the glow of the living room, the laughter that had felt like a blade. I think of the way fate, a student turned cop, a photograph, a neighbor with a casserole, can realign the axis of a story. I think of Mrs. Martha's quiet testimony and of Dr. Linda's steady voice. I think of the judge's measured words and the way power once buffered cruelty with civility. The ledger is complicated. There were wins and losses by every possible measure. At the end of the day, what I tell anyone who will listen is this. If a courtroom does not recognize the full shape of your pain, it does not mean your story is false. It means the instruments of law and the instruments of community are distinct. We fought in both places because we had to, and because our daughter deserved not only legal recognition, but the restoration of her life. What followed the verdict, the casseroles, the fundraising, the volunteer work, the job, the slow courting of a man who would not rush her, those are the pieces of a justice that works in the ordinary. Years from that cold Christmas Eve, when the daffodils come up and the lake shines like a witness, Emily will sometimes stand at the window and look at the town. She is quieter now, but brighter in a way I find harder to describe than any legal term. She has a ring of scars, sure, emotional calluses that tell you where the rope burned her, but they do not define her contour. Jake and she have a small, patient orbit together. They are not the dramatic ending of a novel. They are the daily text messages, the shared coffee, the hand kept in hand. I watch it, and I remember that justice is not always the headline. Sometimes it's a neighbor bringing over a casserole on a Tuesday because they know you need it. If you or someone you know has faced something similar, please share your story below or check the description for resources. There is comfort in being seen, and there is power in small, practical acts. I still think of that photograph of my daughter on the porch, the literal contrast of cold and warmth, of a body shivering where laughter filled a room. It remains the pivot of the story because it contains in a single frame what we were up against and what we tried to reclaim. The court's judgment gave us an ending of legal dissolution and an uncomfortable lesson about the limits of law. But the town's reaction, slow, messy, human, restored something that money and a judge's words could not. Dignity returned piece by piece. That Christmas turned ugly, yes, My daughter was freezing while they laughed by the fire, but she did not stay there. We walked her back into warmth, not as a spectacle, but as a person. The law failed to name all the cruelty we lived through. The people around us, imperfect and slow, helped name the truth in other ways. In the end, the real justice was not the judge's ruling. It was the hot broth on a winter night, the keychain that reminded her growth takes time, the neighbor's casserole, the therapy that taught her how to breathe, and the steady presence of a man who would sit with her scars without making them a show. That, more than any verdict, brought her home.